When I pressed my palm against the lock, it turned so easily it made my stomach lurch. Like no time had passed at all. Like the house had been sitting there, waiting for me. Inside, the smell hit me first. Old wood, mothballs, and something else. Something sour and damp, like wet leaves left to rot in a pile. It brought back this wave of memories I wasn't ready for. The holidays spent here, the sound of my grandmother humming to herself in the kitchen, my grandfather's heavy boots by the back door. I stood there for a minute, taking it all in, feeling like I'd stepped into some kind of preserved version of my childhood. Then I set my bag by the stairs and started opening cabinets. Most of the dishes were still there, stacked neatly behind yellowed contact paper. A stack of newspapers sat on the counter, 2 years old and curling at the edges. My grandmother's knitting basket was under her chair, with that half-finished scarf she'd been working on. The needles were still stuck right where she'd left them, the yarn a little faded. By the time it got fully dark, I'd managed to box up the kitchen and part of the living room. My phone was already complaining, no bars, not even a flicker. I tried moving from window to window to catch a signal and finally got one shaky bar long enough to send my brother a text saying I'd made it. I stood at the sink to eat a cold sandwich, looking out the window into the tree line. The trunks were packed so close together they looked like a single black wall. It was the same feeling I'd had as a kid, like if you stared too long, something might blink back at you. That night, I turned in early. There wasn't much else to do. No TV, no internet, just the old clock ticking in the hallway. I lay on the sagging mattress, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house creak and settle. Every sound seemed too loud. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. At first I thought it was nothing, just the usual pops and groans of an old place cooling off. But then I heard it again, slow, deliberate scraping right under the floorboards. I froze. My heartbeat thumped in my throat. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a possum rooting around under there. But the sound was too measured, too steady, like fingers testing the wood grain, moving back and forth. The scraping paused. Then came this dull thud, like a hand pressing flat against the underside of the floor, feeling for weak spots. I lay there with my fists clenched against the blankets, every muscle locked up. My mouth felt too dry to swallow. The noises went on like that for what felt like an hour, scraping, pausing, pressing, over and over. When it finally stopped, I didn't move. I lay there until the first hint of dawn slipped around the curtains. In the daylight, everything looked normal again. I forced myself to go outside and check the crawlspace vents. Nothing was disturbed, no footprints, no scratches. I told myself I was overtired, maybe still half dreaming. I kept packing all day, but I couldn't stop thinking about that hatch in the kitchen floor, the one that led under the house. Every time I walked past it, I felt this tight little knot under my ribs, like if I looked too long, I'd see it cracked open. The second night, I didn't even bother trying to sleep at first. I just lay there with the blankets pulled up to my chin, staring at the ceiling. Hours passed without a single noise. Eventually, my eyes started to droop. Then, just after midnight, the scraping started again. It was closer this time. I heard it moving along the floor, stopping every few feet. The boards under my bed creaked. I felt my pulse slam against my ribs. My breath was coming in these shallow little gasps I couldn't control. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, like it was testing each plank, searching for the thinnest part. I fumbled for my phone. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped it. No signal, not even the one bar that flickered in the day. The noise stopped. For a second there was total silence. Then I heard a voice, low and muffled, coming from right below me. The words were impossible to understand, just this wet, rasping shape of speech, like someone trying to whisper through a mouthful of mud. I didn't think. I grabbed my bag, swung my legs over the side of the mattress, and ran. At the top of the stairs I stopped. The hatch in the kitchen was creaking open. It lifted slowly, like whatever was underneath was careful not to make too much noise. I could see something pale rising through the gap, a bare shoulder, streaked with dirt. An arm, long and thin, reaching for the floor. I didn't wait. I bolted down the stairs so fast my feet slipped on the runner. I hit the front door, shoved it open, and sprinted across the clearing. My breath was ragged in my throat. The grass was wet and clung to my ankles. I didn't care. I just kept running until I reached the trees. I pressed my back against the rough bark of an oak, trying to make my hands work the phone again. Nothing. I crouched there, holding my breath. For a few seconds, everything went still. Then I heard the front door swing open. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, moved down the porch steps. Into the yard. They paused, then shifted closer. Like whoever it was could feel me nearby, but hadn't pinned down exactly where I was hiding. I pressed my cheek against the bark and stayed perfectly still. My heart was hammering so loud I was sure it would give me away. The footsteps wandered through the grass, stopping every so often. I thought I heard breathing. Wet, labored. Eventually, the steps drifted to the far edge of the clearing. I didn't move until the sky started to pale. When there was enough light to see, I crept back across the yard. My legs felt hollow. The front door was wide open. Inside, the hatch was closed again, neat as you please. I didn't care what I left behind. I packed what I could reach without going upstairs, walked straight out, and drove until the trees fell away behind me. I was 26 the year my cousin Mason decided we should go hiking way out near Fox Hollow. You'd think growing up in eastern Kentucky, we'd have explored every ridge and holler by the time we were old enough to drive. But somehow, neither of us had ever tried going that deep into the woods. And honestly, I never planned to. Everyone in our county knew the stories about that place. My granddad used to sit on the back porch, drinking sweet tea and telling me about hunters who'd gone up the old service trails and never came back. People found their gear or their trucks days later, but not a single track past the last trail marker. He always said those ridges swallowed folks whole, and the way he looked at the tree line when he said it made me feel like he knew something he wasn't sharing. Mason was never one to care about old stories. He had this attitude that if he hadn't seen it himself, it couldn't possibly be real. He'd laugh off any warning, no matter how serious, and start talking about how people just made up ghost tales to keep kids from trespassing. This time, he'd gotten it into his head that he needed to camp somewhere the map goes blank, as he put it. No cell signal, no roads, no signs, just a bunch of old-growth trees and a sense of self-satisfaction. I told him more than once it was a bad plan, but the truth is, I didn't want him thinking I was scared. You spend enough years trying not to look weak in front of someone, it gets hard to draw the line at common sense. So that's how we ended up in Mason's truck, bouncing over potholes toward a rusted-out gate that hadn't been chained in decades. I remember he tapped the horn like we were driving up to a buddy's house, then climbed out to kick the gate open. The hinges made this awful grinding noise, like a scream in slow motion. He thought that was hilarious. We parked in a patch of gravel that looked like it hadn't seen a vehicle in years. When I climbed out, the air smelled musty, almost metallic, like old leaves and something else I couldn't name. I tried to ignore it while we loaded up our packs. The first couple miles felt normal enough. It was early September and everything was still green. The trail started wide and obvious, just an old service road with tire ruts that had filled with rainwater. I kept waiting to see another hiker, but the only signs of life were birds flicking through the branches. Mason looked back at me once and said it felt like we'd stepped out of time, like the world had ended behind us and we hadn't noticed yet. He had a way of saying things that sounded poetic when he wanted them to. Every mile or two we passed some trace of the people who'd lived up there a century ago. Stone chimneys standing alone, piles of broken bottles half buried in dirt, a cast iron stove rusting away in a thicket of honeysuckle. I caught myself wondering about those families, if they'd left willingly, or if something had driven them out. We set up camp that first night by a shallow creek. Mason made a fire with a little pyramid of twigs and a spark wheel he'd bought off the internet. He bragged about how you didn't need matches if you were prepared. Personally, I thought it would have been easier to bring a lighter, but I kept that opinion to myself. I tried to focus on cooking noodles and not on the sense that something was just past the tree line, watching us. My skin felt prickly, like it does when you wake up from a nightmare you can't remember. Mason didn't notice. He was too busy ranting about all the camping videos he'd watched, as if YouTube could protect us from whatever was out there. That night, I lay awake long after he started snoring. The fire had burned down to embers, and the trees around us looked like they were closing in every time I blinked. I'd hear leaves crunch, soft and slow, like footsteps trying not to be footsteps. Then I'd hold my breath and it would stop, over and over, until I was half convinced I was imagining it. I must have slept eventually, because when I woke up, the light was thin and gray. We packed up without saying much. I think Mason was hoping I wouldn't bring up how uneasy I'd looked the night before. The second day, the trail turned into little more than a deer path. You had to pick your way between fallen limbs and watch for holes in the ground where old fence posts had rotted away. Around midday, Mason spotted a sign nailed high up on a poplar. The wood was splintered, the paint so faded it looked almost white, but I could still make out 3 words: no return trail. He laughed, said it had to be somebody's idea of a prank. I didn't answer him. I was too busy trying not to think about what kind of person would hike this far just to nail up a warning. Later, we stopped on this rocky bluff to eat. The slope fell away so steep I could barely see the bottom. I just started unwrapping a protein bar when I noticed something moving between the trees down there. At first, I thought it was an elk, pale, tall, gliding across the gully without a sound. Then it stood up straighter. Its arms were too long, hanging almost to its knees. It turned its head in this slow, methodical way, like it was counting every tree. When it tipped its face toward the sky, I saw the way its jaw split up the middle and fell open. I didn't breathe. My hands clenched so tight on the protein bar the wrapper tore in 2. For a minute, I thought I'd throw up right there, but then it stepped behind a thicket of saplings and vanished, and all I could do was sit there, staring. Mason finally noticed how I looked and asked if I was sick. I tried to speak, but my throat felt glued shut. I nodded, just to get him to stop looking at me. We didn't talk much after that. I think he could tell something had changed. That night, we camped in a hollow barely big enough to fit both our tents. We didn't make a fire. I didn't want anything seeing where we were. I lay in the dark, counting every whip-poor-will call. The space between them started to stretch, and my stomach sank. When the calls stopped altogether, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Then a voice drifted out of the trees. At first, it was just a low mumble, too soft to catch the words. But it grew clearer, and I felt every hair on my arm stand up. It was my mother's voice, the same soft tone she'd used when I was a kid afraid of the dark. "Callan," it said. My chest went hollow. My brain kept trying to find some explanation, maybe a trick of the wind or my imagination playing back old memories. But it was her, down to the little tremble in her vowels. I turned to shake Mason awake. My hand hit nothing but cold nylon. His sleeping bag was empty. I scrambled out of the tent so fast I nearly fell on my face. My flashlight fumbled in my grip. I sucked in a lungful of cold, musty air and called his name. The trees swallowed my voice. Then I heard her again, farther downslope. Some part of me wanted to run toward it. Like maybe if I did, I'd find her sitting there, smiling, waiting to hug me. But something deeper, older, kept me frozen. I turned in a slow circle with the light. That's when I saw it. About 20 yards away, half hidden behind a black oak, it stood watching me. Its skin looked slick, stretched too thin over bones that didn't fit right. Long arms hung slack, fingers brushing the leaves. Its chest rose and fell, slow and deliberate. I couldn't see any eyes. That was the worst part. If I'd seen eyes, maybe I could have looked away. It shifted, sliding sideways around the trunk, shoulders twisting in a way no person's ever could. It circled, slow and patient, like it knew I couldn't decide whether to run or stay rooted. I stumbled back and caught my shin on a rock. My flashlight beam jittered over the trees. That's when I saw a second one. Just a flicker of pale skin between trunks. That did it. I bolted. I crashed through brambles and over deadfall, branches whipping my face and arms. My heart felt like it was going to tear out of my ribs. Behind me, voices rose up, first my mother's, then Mason's, then my own. All of them calling my name in different pitches. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran. The dark blurred everything but the thought, don't stop. Just keep going. When I finally hit the old service road, the sky was starting to rise. My legs buckled. I dropped in the dirt and lay there, panting so hard my throat burned. Later, a Forest Service truck rolled up. The ranger climbed out slow, like he was afraid he'd startle me. He helped me into the cab, gave me water, and tried not to look too worried. When he asked where Mason was, I couldn't answer. I just shook my head. I didn't tell him what I saw. He would have believed me if I had. I grew up in this tiny patch of southern Missouri that most folks would miss if they blinked driving through. I spent most of my 20s telling myself I was done with it. I'd moved to St. Louis, got a job that didn't require boots, and tried to convince myself I'd never have to come back except for... But last October, my Uncle Randall passed, so I drove back, mostly out of obligation. After the funeral, this small, quiet service in a brick church that smelled like lemon oil and old hymnals, I walked out into the parking lot and just stood there with my hands in my pockets, feeling like something was stuck under my ribs. I couldn't tell if it was grief or if it was something older, something I'd carried with me since I was a kid and never shook loose. That Sunday afternoon, I packed a rucksack. Nothing fancy, just a tarp, my old sleeping bag, a couple of protein bars, and the hunting knife I'd had since I was 17. It still had my initials scratched into the handle from the day I got it. I filled my thermos with whatever coffee was left in the pot at the gas station and drove out to this trail I'd only ever heard people talk about after a couple drinks. Folks called it Jasper Bend. Supposedly, way back in the 1800s, a group of loggers disappeared there. Some people said it was a rock slide. Others swore it was something they couldn't explain. You'd hear the stories if you hung around the VFW long enough, but nobody agreed on what actually happened. All I really knew was nobody bothered to keep it cleared, and you could hike out there for days and never run into anybody. I think that's what I wanted, to be alone. By the time I turned off onto the gravel shoulder, the sun was already sinking behind the ridge. There was this rusted-out gate hanging on one hinge, and a wooden sign so weathered the letters were just shallow grooves you could barely read if you squinted. For a second, I thought about turning around. I could have driven back to town, slept in the guest room at my mom's, tried to act normal, but the quiet out there felt like the only thing I had left that might help. So I killed the engine, locked the truck, and started down the trail. It wasn't much of a trail, if I'm honest. Just a narrow crease through the underbrush, choked with brambles and old fallen branches. Every so often, the ground would dip away into these sudden gullies carved by runoff over who knows how many years. I slipped once, caught myself on a root that felt damp and soft, and when I looked up, I could see the ridge through a mess of bare branches. It struck me right then how easy it would be to vanish out there, how a person could just step wrong and disappear and nobody would ever know exactly where they'd gone. About a mile in, I came across what must have been an old fence line. The boards were collapsed, half buried in the dirt, like the earth was trying to swallow them. Just past it, there was a clearing, probably no bigger than my kitchen, circled by stones that looked like the last scraps of a foundation. Right in the middle, a crooked sapling was growing out of a shallow pit. I don't know why, but seeing it made my mouth go dry, like I'd swallowed sod. I skirted around it without stepping closer. The light was almost gone by the time the trail curved down toward the river. The water was so low, it looked more like a line of wet rocks than a real stream. I found a flat spot under the bluff where the ground seemed dry enough, even if it felt a little too close to the water for comfort. My boots left these dark prints in the silt, and for a second, I just stood there, listening. When I bent to set my pack down, that's when I saw them. Footprints coming up behind me. They were faint, almost smudged into the dirt, like they'd been left when the ground was still damp from rain. What got me was how narrow they were, too narrow for an adult. And some were so far apart that whoever made them must have been jumping or walking in a way I couldn't picture. My stomach twisted, but I told myself maybe they were old, weeks old, maybe longer. I forced myself to keep moving. I built a little fire, sat close enough that I could feel the heat on my face, and pulled out a paperback I'd brought. I read the same page 3 times without taking in a word. That was when I heard it. This low, 2-note whistle, drifting down the slope. The sound was too clean, too deliberate. I held my breath, waiting. A few seconds later it came again, the same notes, the same pause afterward, like whoever made it was listening for something. My mouth felt dry as chalk. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded too thin, like it didn't belong to me. Nothing answered. I waited until the fire burned down to coals. The whistle didn't come back, but the silence felt worse somehow. Like everything out there was holding its breath. Eventually, I let the fire go to embers and crawled into my tent. I didn't zip it all the way. I lay on my back with the knife handle resting across my chest, staring at the fabric overhead. My shoulders were so tense they hurt. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke up hours later with my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might bruise my ribs. I stayed completely still, listening. That's when I heard it, a slow crunch of leaves, one careful step at a time. It was close. Maybe 10 feet away, moving around the edge of the bluff. I waited, hoping whatever it was would keep going. But the step stopped right outside my tent. The air felt like it had thickened somehow, pressing down on me. Then something pressed against the nylon, just one finger, tracing the curve of the fabric above my knee. My jaw clenched so tight I felt my teeth ache. The finger moved again, slower, feeling the shape of my leg. I shut my eyes. I didn't breathe. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Finally, the pressure lifted. I heard the steps again, moving away, deliberate, careful, until the sound faded into the trees. I didn't move until the first gray light slid over the ridge. When I finally crawled out, my hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the knife. There weren't any tracks, no broken branches, nothing that showed anyone had been there. I tore the camp down in minutes. My pack was a mess, scoreds trailing, tarp half unrolled. But I didn't care. I needed to be moving. I didn't stop to eat or drink. I just walked, my head down, the strap digging into the same spot on my shoulder until I felt like it might cut through skin. Every step made my jaw clench tighter. When I finally reached the trailhead, I could see my truck through the trees. Relief hit me so fast my knees almost buckled. I stumbled into the clearing and stopped. Something was propped against the driver's side door. It was a strip of pale bark, curled up at the edges. Someone had carved a shape into it. Long legs, an oval head, no arms, just that blank silhouette. I grew up in a little town called Elkford. You probably haven't heard of it. It's basically a scatter of houses jammed into a fold of the Allegheny foothills. No stoplights, no gas station, just a bait shop that sells coffee so stale it tastes like burnt cardboard. The house I ended up staying in belonged to my uncle. Everyone called it the place out by Nolan's Hollow, as if that explained everything. It was this narrow, 2-story thing, built out of wood so old it had gone gray. The foundation was stacked stone, some of it cracked so wide you could lose your keys in the gaps. For most of my life, I only ever visited on Thanksgiving, and even then, I didn't like staying past sundown. But last December, after everything in my life went sideways, I decided I'd move in for a while. I kept telling myself it was temporary, just a break to get my head straight, figure out what came next. My girlfriend had left the month before, my hours at the mechanic shop got cut, and my mom kept calling to ask if I was managing okay, which really meant she thought I was falling apart. Probably wasn't wrong. So I loaded up my truck with a mattress, a couple boxes of books, some clothes, and drove out there in the middle of a freezing rainstorm. The first few weeks weren't so bad. The days were quiet. I'd split wood out by the shed, patch the worst of the drafty spots, and sit on the porch with coffee that tasted about as bad as the bait shops. At night, though, the house had a way of reminding me I was alone. The beams would creak, sometimes in these slow, popping sounds that made me imagine someone pacing overhead. I tried not to think too hard about it. I kept the generator fueled and the propane tanks lined up in the mudroom. It just felt smarter to be prepared. And yeah, I had a revolver in a little lockbox by the bed. Not because I thought I'd need it, but everyone in Elkford acted like it was common sense. Out here, you didn't assume you were safe just because you locked the door. That night started out the same as any other. I made some instant noodles, tasted about as good as warm glue, read an old paperback I'd already been through twice, and did the usual circuit to check the doors and windows. I'd gotten into this habit of double-checking the deadbolts before I turned in. I guess part of me needed to see the locks engaged to believe they'd keep anything out. It must have been around 10 when I heard the first noise. It wasn't loud, just a soft scraping, like something thin getting dragged across the porch. For a second, I didn't even look up from my book. There were so many animals around, half-feral cats and raccoons that would climb up on the railings. But then it came again, longer this time. A dry papery sound that ended with 3 little taps against the door. I put my book down, spine up on the coffee table, and walked over to the window by the door. The porch looked empty. The old rocking chair sat perfectly still, not even a twitch. I cracked the door open an inch and a rush of cold air hit me in the face. It smelled damp and a little sour, like wet leaves left to rot. I leaned out just far enough to look left and right. Nothing moved. No footprints. No sign of anyone. I shut the door and locked it again. My shoulders were tight, like I was waiting for something to lunge out of the dark and grab me. I switched off the lamp and sat back down. My eyes adjusted slowly. Shapes emerged. The couch, the stack of firewood, the little glow from the generator light in the kitchen. I kept telling myself it was just some animal. Maybe a possum. Maybe a branch fallen against the siding. But then, right before midnight, came the knock. 3 short raps, calm. Like whoever was out there didn't feel the need to hurry. I stood so fast the book fell off the table and hit the floor with a smack. I didn't call out. Didn't ask who it was. Just walked over, rested my palm flat against the door. The wood was cold, almost wet. Hello? Nothing. Not a shuffle of feet, not even the creak of the porch boards. I leaned into the peephole. The porch was exactly the same, empty. I stepped back, locked the door again for good measure. My heart was beating so hard I felt a little lightheaded, like I just sprinted a mile. I went back to my chair, but this time I picked up the revolver and laid it across my knees. I kept telling myself it was all in my head. This was an old house, alone in the woods. Nothing unusual about creaks and knocks. An hour passed. I didn't move. Eventually, the adrenaline started to wear off. My arms went numb from holding still so long. Part of me started to think it was over, that whatever it was had given up and left. I stood up to stretch my back. My legs felt stiff and clumsy. I thought maybe I'd go upstairs, make sure the windows were locked, and try to get some sleep. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Upstairs, not just a random creak, actual footsteps, slow and steady, moving from the end of the hall to the top of the stairs. I froze. revolver clutched so tight my knuckles ached. I waited, hoping it would stop, but the steps came again, heavier this time, crossing back toward the spare room. I turned the lamp on. The circle of light made everything look flat and washed out. My hand went to the lockbox, just out of habit. That's when I saw it was already open. I'd forgotten to close it after cleaning the revolver last week. I checked the cylinder, loaded, and walked over to the base of the stairs. Anyone up there? No reply. I took the first step. It groaned under my weight. The footsteps started again. Back and forth, deliberate, like they wanted me to hear. I climbed to the landing, every step feeling harder than the last. My uncle's old bedroom door was cracked open an inch. I raised the gun. My free hand found the switch on the wall. I flicked it up. Nothing. The bulb had been working that afternoon. I pushed the door open with my shoulder. The room was empty. Bare mattress, empty dresser drawers, the window locked. I backed out slowly, trying not to blink. I closed the door and turned toward my bedroom. That's when I heard it. A whisper coming from the other side of my door. It was this thin, papery voice repeating the same string of words in a language I'd never heard. I inched closer, revolver trembling in my hand. I pressed my ear to the door, felt my pulse hammering against the wood. I took a breath that felt too shallow to do anything and swung the door open. Silence. The room looked exactly the same. My unmade bed, my duffel bag propped against the closet. Then, from the corner of my eye, something moved. A shape slipped along the wall. Tall, thin, wrapped in something that looked like it belonged in the ground. I jerked the revolver up, finger pressing the trigger. But before I could squeeze it, the shape was gone, sliding out the door. I backed up so fast I hit the dresser. I didn't think. I turned and ran. Down the stairs, out the door, across the yard. My boots skidded on the gravel, but I didn't stop. I kept running until I reached the bend where the trees opened up to the road. I stopped there, bent over, gasping so hard it felt like my ribs might snap. My throat tasted metallic, like blood. I turned back. The house stood there, perfectly still. I waited there until sunrise and never went back. I was 24 when I got the bright idea to ride that old service road behind my grandfather's place in eastern Tennessee. My uncle used to talk about that hollow like it was a stain you couldn't scrub out of the family history. He'd lean back in his chair, pick at the label on his beer, and say things like, "That hollow's older than any grave you'll find around here." Then he'd change the subject, like he'd realized he was about to say too much. I always figured it was superstition, just a way to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods and getting snake bit or lost. I hadn't been back to that house in a long time, not since I was a teenager. When my grandfather died, somebody had to come clean out what was left. It turned out that what was left was a lot. The place looked like it had been trying to sink back into the hillside from the moment he passed. Kudzu was swallowing everything, climbing the porch, curling over the gutters, pushing through the window screens. The old satellite dish was folded in half under the weight of the vines. Even the porch swing had collapsed in on itself like it just gave up. Inside wasn't any better. Every room smelled like a mix of mildew, old newspapers, and that sour edge of mouse droppings. It was the kind of smell that gets into your hair and your clothes, so you carry it around even after you leave. I spent the whole day hauling out boxes. Bundles of moth-eaten quilts, stacks of water-warped magazines, jars of who knows what sealed up so long the labels had peeled off. I kept telling myself I was making progress, but every time I turned around there was another corner crammed full of stuff. By dusk, my shoulders were aching so bad it felt like my arms had turned into lead pipes. I remember standing in the kitchen, just staring at the counter and thinking how much quieter it was without him there. That's when I saw the Polaris keys hanging from a bent nail by the doorframe. It was such an ordinary little thing it almost knocked me sideways with memories. I used to ride that ATV all over the property, tearing down the trails while my grandfather leaned on the porch rail pretending he wasn't watching. He'd never say anything, just squint at me like he was waiting to see if I'd do something stupid. Usually I did. I don't know exactly what made me decide to take it out that evening. Maybe it was the quiet pressing in on me. Maybe I was just trying to remember what it felt like to be a kid again, before everything got heavy. I didn't overthink it. I just grabbed the keys, slung my leg over the seat, and kicked the engine on. I started up the trail behind the barn. It was the same rutted path that had been there since the first time I visited as a little kid. Back then, it had felt endless, like it went all the way to the edge of the world. The first stretch was all cracked pavement, grass creeping in at the sides, the old fence drooping between leaning posts. After about a mile, the pavement turned to hard-packed clay. The ruts were deep enough to jolt my spine every few yards. My teeth actually clicked together once, and I had this sudden, stupid thought that I was going to chip one. I passed this old hunting blind up in a black walnut tree, just a square of gray plywood nailed to the trunk. I remembered it from when I was a kid, but it had definitely gotten worse. The side panels were hanging in tatters, and the ladder was snapped halfway up, splintered in a way that didn't look like rot, more like something big had put its weight on it. I slowed down without meaning to. The hair on my arms prickled up. For a second, I thought about turning back, but I didn't. I told myself it was nothing. Just old wood and too many seasons of rain. I kept going another 15 minutes. The trail dipped into this wide clearing, a shallow bowl in the earth, ringed with black locust trees. 3 trailers sat there in a crooked half circle. They looked like they'd been dragged out there decades ago and abandoned to rust in place. The siding was pitted with holes, the windows punched out, the doors were missing entirely. I remember thinking it looked like a place where nothing good ever happened. The sort of place you'd expect to find a couple of buzzards picking over something they shouldn't. Then I noticed the tire tracks. They were fresh, clear as anything. The dirt was still soft where the tread had pressed in. I killed the engine and sat there for a second, listening to the quiet. It wasn't the normal kind of quiet either. No birds, no insects. Just a hollow stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I swung my leg off the ATV. My boots sank into the damp ground. Each step felt like it took too long, like I was wading through something thicker than air. When I reached the nearest trailer, I had to brace one hand on the doorway because my legs were unsteady. Inside, the floor was buried under old leaves and scraps of stained carpet. In the far corner, there was a pile of bones, small ones, maybe dogs, maybe deer, picked clean and stacked in careful rows, like whoever had done it wanted them arranged just so. I turned to leave, and that's when I noticed the twine strung across the doorway. Little gray shapes dangled from it, clacking gently in the breeze I couldn't feel. I leaned closer, squinting. For a moment, I thought they were rocks. Then I realized they were skulls. Each one drilled through and threaded like beads. My throat closed up. I stumbled backward, almost tripped over a piece of broken concrete. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it was going to choke me. I should have left right then, climbed back on the ATV and gotten the hell out. But some part of me had to know where those tracks led. It wasn't curiosity, exactly. More like this dull, stubborn need to see it through. Like if I stopped halfway, I'd never be able to forget it. So I followed the trail past the trailers. The path narrowed into switchbacks that snaked down through the trees. Every so often there were boards nailed to the trunks, painted with symbols I didn't recognize. Circles slashed with diagonal lines, spirals wrapped around stick figures. Some looked like they'd been drawn with something that dried brown and flaked when the wind hit. I tried not to think about that too hard. I don't know how long I walked. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. It felt like the sun was slipping away faster than it should have, like time itself was trying to nudge me out of there. The trail leveled into a hollow, so deep it was almost dark. A collapsed stone foundation sagged into the hillside. There was a doorway sunk into the wall, a black hole big enough to walk through if you really wanted to. I edged closer. The smell hit me about 6 feet away, a thick, sweet rot that clung to the back of my throat. I gagged and pulled my shirt over my nose. My flashlight felt heavy in my hand. I clicked it on and aimed the beam inside. In the far corner, a pile of burlap sacks shifted. Just a slow, deliberate movement, like something inside was trying to roll over. I heard a scraping breath, low and wet. My knees went loose. For a second, I thought I was going to fall face first into the doorway. I took one step back. Before I could take another, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I froze. Every thought just dropped out of my head. When I turned, there was a man standing next to me. He wore a battered canvas hat pulled low over his face. His beard was streaked white. His mouth twisted into this polite, humorless smile. "Don't go in there," he said, like he was giving me directions to the post office. I couldn't move, couldn't answer. He raised one finger to his lips. "You don't belong here. Turn around." Still, I just stood there, my whole body locked up. He leaned closer. His breath smelled like soil after rain. "Run!" He let go of me, and whatever was holding me still snapped. I spun around and bolted up the trail. My legs were shaking so hard I nearly went down twice. I didn't look back. I knew if I did, I'd see something I'd never be able to scrub out of my mind. I don't know how long it took me to reach the clearing again. The trailers loomed in the dusk, empty windows gaping. I clambered onto the ATV with both hands shaking so bad I almost dropped the keys. When the engine finally caught, I turned it too hard and fishtailed in the dirt. I gunned it up the hill, not caring if I tore the suspension out. I didn't slow down until the barn roof came into view between the trees. I parked by the porch and sat there with my hands gripping the handlebars. I tried to think of a single way to explain any of it. Every version sounded like something I'd read in a cheap horror novel. When the sun finally rose, I loaded the last of my stuff into the truck. I didn't call the sheriff, just slid the keys under the loose brick on the porch. I was 24 when I said yes to helping my cousin clear out her grandfather's cabin. I'd grown up not far from there, but this place was tucked so deep in the Blue Ridge that my phone lost signal a mile before we even turned off the main road. The driveway looked more like an old logging track than something meant for cars, just a pair of ruts in the dirt, choked with weeds and broken branches. You'd never spot it unless you knew exactly where to look. Even as we bumped along, I remember thinking it felt wrong that anyone had ever decided to build a house out there in the first place. Paige, my cousin, had been putting this off for almost a month. Her grandfather had died alone in the kitchen. Nobody realized it until the mail started spilling off the porch in neat little slides. A neighbor finally noticed the stack and called the county. By the time the sheriff broke in, the old man had been gone for days. Maybe longer. Paige kept telling me she wasn't up for going inside by herself. She'd say it on the phone in this brittle voice, like she was afraid I'd think she was being dramatic. I didn't. I understood exactly why she didn't want to set foot in there. When we finally reached the clearing, the cabin looked worse than I'd expected. It leaned hard to one side, like the whole thing was trying to sink into the ground. Half the shingles were missing. A busted porch rail hung by a single nail. I parked behind her Corolla, and for a long minute we just sat there, with the engine ticking as it cooled. Neither of us moved. It was the middle of the afternoon, but the trees pressed in so tight that the clearing felt dim anyway. I tried to ignore the knot in my stomach. "You brought a flashlight, right?" she asked, still staring straight ahead. "Yeah," I said. I reached over and popped the glove compartment, even though I already knew it was in there. Just holding it made me feel a little steadier. She blew out a shaky breath. Her hand trembled when she opened the door. The porch steps creaked under us. I half expected one of them to give out, but they held. When I nudged the front door with my toe, it drifted open like it had been waiting. The smell hit me first, a heavy, stale odor, something between mildew and old cooking grease. It was the kind of smell that stuck to your hair and clothes. Dust coated everything. There was a sagging recliner in the corner and a folding table covered in a mess of newspapers and half-empty cans. Paige pulled her t-shirt over her nose. God, it's worse than I thought. Let's just get it done, I said. We split up without really talking about it. She started on the living room, dropping old mail and papers into trash bags. I walked through to the kitchen. The linoleum was cracked and peeling at the corners, and there, right by the stove, was the dark stain. I didn't look at it longer than I had to. I opened a few cabinets just to be thorough. Inside, I found boxes of cereals so old the cardboard had gone soft, and glass jars full of what might have been preserves once. I didn't touch any of it. In the hallway, I peeked into the bedroom. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with more jars. Some had labels in spidery handwriting: okra, beans, peaches. Most of the contents had collapsed into a grayish mush that made my stomach turn. One jar held a pale lump that looked almost like an animal, curled in on itself. For a second, I thought it might still be breathing. But I backed out and shut the door. I hauled an armload of blankets outside and dumped them in a pile. Every time I went back in, the air felt thicker, like it was pressing on my chest. Paige didn't say much. Every so often, I'd catch her glancing down the hallway, her eyes fixed on the closed bedroom door. Once, I asked her what she was looking at, and she just shook her head. A couple hours passed like that. We worked in silence. The only sounds, the rustle of trash bags and the occasional creak of floorboards under our feet. When the light started to fade, I looked at my watch and felt my throat tighten. We need to check the cellar before it's dark, I told her. She froze, her hand still buried in a box of papers. He never let me down there, she said quietly. He used to tell me it wasn't safe. I tried to keep my voice light, even though it came out strained. Not safe how? She just shrugged, but her shoulders were locked up near her ears, like she was bracing for something to hit her. I decided not to push. I went to the back of the kitchen and pulled open the cellar door. The hinges groaned. Cold air spilled up around my ankles. My flashlight beam wavered as I stepped onto the stairs. They were steep and narrow, built out of unfinished boards. My boots left damp prints behind me. About halfway down, the smell hit me, like wet fur mixed with something sour and rotting. I tried to breathe through my mouth. The cellar floor was just packed dirt. My light picked out a big wooden work table, the surface gouged with dozens of shallow cuts. Iron hooks dangled empty above it, gently swaying as if someone had just brushed past. On the far wall, a row of shelves held more jars. The liquid inside looked yellowish, and the things floating in it didn't resemble anything I recognized. I was moving closer, thinking I'd just take a quick look so I could say I'd done it, when I heard footsteps on the floor above me. Slow, deliberate. "Paige?" I called. No answer. My heart felt like it was trying to crawl up my throat. I climbed the stairs fast, 2 at a time. When I reached the top, the door swung shut in my face. The latch clicked home with a dull snap that made my chest go cold. "Hey!" I smacked my palm against the door so hard my skin stung. "Paige, open the door!" Her voice came through, muffled and shaky. "Elowen, there's someone outside." My mouth went dry. "What do you mean, someone?" "He's standing in the trees." I pressed my forehead to the wood. "Just open the door, okay? He's watching me." Then I heard her step away. "Paige?" "Nothing." I swallowed, trying to keep my hands steady on the flashlight. My beam wobbled across the dirt floor. Behind me, something shifted. I turned, and for a second I thought my brain was playing tricks on me. A shape uncurled itself from behind a stack of burlap sacks. Thin limbs, too long to belong to any animal I knew. One arm stretched out, and the elbow bent the wrong way with a little pop. I backed up until my spine hit the stairs. My breath was coming in sharp, broken gasps. It raised its head. My flashlight caught smooth skin pulled tight over a skull. No eyes, no mouth, just blank, pale flesh. It began to crawl toward me, dragging itself inch by inch. Each movement made a soft, sucking sound. I threw my shoulder against the door. Wood splintered. I hit it again and again. On the third slam, It flew open so fast I stumbled into the kitchen. Paige stood by the table, staring past me, her eyes huge. "Where is he?" I gasped. Her voice was flat. "He walked back into the trees." I didn't wait for more. I grabbed her wrist, practically dragging her across the porch. My truck was right where I'd left it. I didn't look over my shoulder until we were halfway down the driveway. Through the windshield, I saw a shape slip between the trees. Tall, thin, moving in a way I couldn't even process. Paige let out one strangled sob and clamped her hand over her mouth. I pressed the gas pedal down hard, gravel spitting out behind the tires. We didn't say another word until we hit pavement. I was 32 when I finally decided to spend a full week alone in the most remote stretch of the Blue Valley Range I could reach without hiring a guide. I'd been camping for years, plenty of long weekends, a couple of week-long treks, but something about going completely off-grid kept nagging at me, like it was the only way I'd ever really prove to myself that I could handle absolute solitude. I couldn't quite put that feeling into words, but it settled in my chest and wouldn't leave me alone. I started planning a month ahead. Every evening after work, I'd spread out my new topographic maps across the kitchen table. I'd run my finger along old forestry roads and look for places with no maintained trails, nothing marked except an occasional stream or an elevation line. One night, I even dug out an old pamphlet I'd picked up at a ranger station years ago. It had a faded cover showing a black and white photo of some cabin ruin and a heading that said something like "Unrecorded Hollows of the Blue Valley." The pages were warped with moisture, but there was just enough detail to get me curious. I didn't want to leave anything to chance. I ordered a new tent that claimed it could stand up to surprise downpours without leaking. I bought extra batteries, restocked my little first aid kit, and added a small hand-crank radio. The radio was mostly for my peace of mind. I'd never used one, but it felt like a good last resort if something went sideways. I even packed 3 different knives, which in hindsight sounds a little dramatic, but at the time it felt like exactly the right amount of caution. Before I left, I called my brother Matt. I made a point of sounding casual, though I could tell he was skeptical. I told him I'd be out at least 6 days, maybe 7, and he shouldn't worry if I didn't check in right away. He sighed and said something about how I was basically asking to star in my own missing persons documentary. I laughed it off, even though a little part of me wondered if he had a point. The morning I left, I got up before dawn. My old Subaru looked like it was sagging under the weight of all my gear. The back was so crammed with supplies, I had to wedge my sleeping bag behind the passenger's seat. As I drove, I kept picturing the trailhead. In my imagination, it was this welcoming portal into adventure. When I finally pulled over onto East Wick Trace, it was really just a gravel scrape on the shoulder of the road. No sign, no marker, no helpful arrow. Just an opening in the trees that looked like a deer track no one had walked in decades. I almost turned around right then, but I'd spent too much time preparing to back out over a lack of signage. So I killed the engine, hauled my pack out of the back, and stood there for a moment listening to the quiet. Then, I set off. That first day was exactly what I'd hoped for. The silence was almost a relief. I didn't pass a single person. I covered 12 miles, maybe a little more. The only traces of other people were the crumbling chimney standing by itself in a clearing and a row of rusted fence posts that ended abruptly at the tree line. A couple of times I had to step over tangles of vine that had claimed the path so completely it looked like they were trying to erase it. Late in the afternoon, I reached the ridge I'd marked on my map with a note that just read, "Good flat ground." Turned out I was right. About 100 yards to the west, the slope dropped into a hollow where a narrow stream ran over pale rocks. I set up my tent in this shallow, natural bowl between 3 boulders. The spot felt hidden in a way that made my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. I spent an hour hauling smooth stones up from the creek to build a fire ring. When I finally lit the fire, I sat on my pack and just watched it burn. The quiet was different from anything I'd experienced before. No hum of distant cars, no planes overhead, not even other campers' voices echoing through the trees. just the occasional click of a branch dropping somewhere I couldn't see. Dinner was a pouch of freeze-dried stew I'd been putting off trying. It tasted like warm salt, with a few chewy lumps thrown in for variety. Still, it was filling enough that I felt drowsy by the time the sky went dark. I made a few notes in my journal about the route I'd taken and which game trails might be worth exploring later. When I finally crawled into the tent, I rested my hand on the handle of my belt knife. Not because I was scared, at least that's what I told myself, but because it was a habit I'd picked up on solo trips. A little reassurance in the dark. The second morning, I woke up to a thin layer of mist